Ladies and gentlemen, let's stop dancing around the edges and start talking about what really matters. We live in an age where speculation masquerades as fact, where fear is packaged as truth, and where geopolitical chess games are played with the lives of millions. Tonight, we're not here for empty headlines or clickbait theories. We're here to dig into something far more urgent, far more unsettling, yet absolutely necessary to confront. Why is a nation as embattled and calculated as Israel now being linked to the possibility of targeting Pakistan? This isn't just about foreign policy or intelligence maneuvers. It's about the global balance of power, nuclear deterrence, religious tensions, and the chilling reality of what happens when two volatile players are pushed to the edge. You may not want to believe it. You may find it uncomfortable. Good. The truth often is, we can no longer afford to be passive spectators to the dangerous narratives swirling in diplomatic shadows. This is about truth, strategy, survival, and whether we, as a global community, are capable of seeing through the fog of misinformation and manipulation before it's too late. So I urge you, open your mind, steady your nerves, and prepare to question everything you've been told. Because once we peel back the veil, what lies beneath might just change your view of global affairs forever. Let's begin. Power doesn't announce itself politely. It doesn't knock before entering. It crashes through the front door, makes itself at home, and redraws the rules of the house. And in the ruthless theater of international politics, power is rarely about morality. It's about leverage. That's why when you strip away the political niceties and media spin, you begin to see the raw strategic interests that drive seemingly illogical behavior on the world stage. This isn't about good guys and bad guys. It's about control, survival, and who gets to write the future. Israel, a nation forged in fire, surrounded by hostility since birth, has always had to think 10 steps ahead. You don't survive thousands of years of persecution, genocide, and existential threat without developing a mindset carved out of stone. It's David against Goliath, but David, this time, is armed with drones, satellites, and precision strike capabilities. Israel has learned that to survive in a world that often seems indifferent to its right to exist, it must always know who its potential enemies are, even before they show their hand. And Pakistan, with its nuclear arsenal and deep-rooted ties to ideological movements that don't exactly view Israel with warmth, is no footnote in this equation. This isn't paranoia, it's preparation. Proverbs 27:12 says, "The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty." Israel does not do simple, it does strategic. It sees danger long before others do and positions itself accordingly. But this isn't a one-sided story. Let's not pretend Pakistan is merely a passive actor in a global drama. It, too, has its own deeply embedded strategic interests. Interests shaped by decades of conflict, complex alliances with superpowers, and a history of military entanglements with both neighbors and ideological allies. It walks a tightrope between diplomacy and defiance, between maintaining international legitimacy and feeding internal nationalistic fires. That tightrope can snap under pressure. Now here's the uncomfortable truth the world doesn't want to admit. Sometimes nations act not because they want to, but because they feel they must. Strategic interests aren't built on dreams, they're built on threats, real or perceived. And once the intelligence community starts whispering about missile tests, secret meetings, and shifting alliances, those whispers don't stay whispers for long. They become policies, they become preemptive doctrines, they become reality. You see, this is not about whether Israel should see Pakistan as a threat. It's about whether it does. And in international relations, perception is reality. It always has been. Just like in the Old Testament, when King Jehoshaphat went out to battle with only singers at the front lines, singing praises to the Lord, because he believed that faith alone would confuse the enemy. Strategy born from belief, yes, even faith, has always shaped outcomes. But today, nations don't sing psalms. They launch preemptive strikes and call it defense. We're living in a time where chessboards stretch across continents, and every move is calculated, precise, and filled with consequence. And make no mistake, if Israel sees an alliance forming that might pose a future existential threat, whether ideological, nuclear, or political, it will act. It has to. Because history has taught Israel a brutal lesson. Never wait for the sword to fall before you raise your shield. There is no greater illusion in modern warfare than the idea that nuclear weapons are silent trophies, dormant artifacts of power, only meant to deter and never to be used. That belief is not just naive, it's dangerous. Nuclear capability is not merely a badge of sovereignty, it is a declaration. A nation that wields it is not whispering its presence, it is roaring its potential. And in a world where one misstep, one misinterpreted signal, or one rogue actor can ignite catastrophe, the roar echoes far beyond borders. Pakistan holds this power. So does Israel. But here's what separates them. Not just geography, but theology, ideology, and deeply contrasting perceptions of threat. While one frames its deterrence in the shadow of India, the other sees survival as a daily pursuit surrounded by historical animosity. And when two nuclear-armed states exist within a global climate of suspicion, propaganda, and increasing technological warfare, the room for misunderstanding shrinks to a terrifyingly narrow margin. The mere possession of nuclear weapons changes the spiritual and strategic posture of a nation. It becomes, as Ecclesiastes says, a time to kill and a time to heal. The existence of the weapon is its own argument, its own sermon. It speaks without being launched. Now let's be clear. Deterrence is not peace. It is fear disguised as balance. It is a world where countries do not refrain from conflict out of goodwill, but out of the understanding that mutual annihilation is just a button away. This is not stability. This is a standoff. And when mistrust simmers between two nations with such capabilities, even silence becomes a threat. Think of it like this. A man walking through a crowded square with a loaded rifle slung across his shoulder isn't necessarily committing a crime. But everyone around him is watching. Nervous, uncertain, multiply that by millions, by generations of hatred, and by global media manipulation. And that's what nuclear diplomacy feels like. Israel knows what it means to be cornered. Its doctrine of defense is not shaped by theory. It is shaped by ashes, carved from the smoke of Auschwitz and the wars of 1948, 1967, and beyond. Its stance on nuclear preparedness is not theoretical. It's theological. It believes in never again will it allow the world to watch as its people are marched toward extinction. That belief isn't policy. It's blood memory. And if a nation like Pakistan, whose political identity is entangled in religious antagonism toward Zionism, escalates even subtly in its rhetoric or its alliances, Israel hears it loud and clear. Therein lies the peril. When deterrence rests not just on power, but on belief, on history, on prophecy, on generational pain, it ceases to be about rational choices. It becomes a battle of destinies. And when two destinies collide, the world holds its breath. Not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. Lies don't need facts to survive. They just need repetition. And propaganda, my friends, is the most dangerous sermon never preached. It disguises itself as truth, wraps itself in patriotism, cloaks itself in morality, and before you even realize it, it's carved new enemies out of thin air. That's the world we live in today. A world where misinformation is not a mistake but a weapon. And that weapon is aimed at minds long before missiles are ever aimed at borders. The war for public perception is more ruthless than any drone strike. Why? Because once you shape what people believe, you shape what they will accept. And when a nation, any nation, is fed a steady diet of fear, fear of the other, fear of being replaced, fear of extinction, it begins to justify anything in the name of survival. That is how propaganda fuels misunderstanding. It is not content to just confuse, it wants to divide. It wants to harden hearts and twist logic until brother turns against brother, and the world cheers the fall of another, because they've been taught to see them as less than human. This is where we must remember the warning of Isaiah 5:20. Woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness. That's what happens when propaganda succeeds. Truth is no longer measured by scripture or conscience, but by consensus and clicks. And it spreads. Like a fire lit in dry grass, it doesn't need much to take root. A manipulated video, a mistranslated quote, a rumor whispered in the right circles. That's all it takes to spark outrage, to ignite hatred, and to fuel policy decisions built on sand instead of stone. Consider the narratives being spun about Israel and Pakistan. Entire populations have been programmed to hate without ever asking why. Flags become more important than facts, and instead of seeking understanding, people seek revenge for things they never experienced firsthand. It's tribalism with a digital megaphone, a global game of broken telephone. Only this one ends in bombs, not laughter. And yet here lies the deeper tragedy. We, the people, have stopped asking questions. We've stopped challenging the headlines. We've grown lazy with our discernment. Hosea 4:6 says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Not destroyed by bombs, not by tanks, but by ignorance, by blind faith in agendas we never voted for, and in narratives designed to dehumanize before they demonize. So, when a nation like Israel sees hostility broadcasted daily from factions in Pakistan, when rallies chant death to Zionism, and textbooks erase the legitimacy of a state, it doesn't see that as empty rhetoric. It sees warning signs. Propaganda may start with words, but history has shown us again and again it never ends there. We must wake up. We must reclaim the ability to see through the fog. Because the greatest threat to peace isn't just hatred, it's manipulated hatred, manufactured outrage, synthetic division. And if we keep swallowing what's served without questioning the recipe, we'll find ourselves dining at the table of destruction and calling it diplomacy. You no longer need to invade a nation to conquer it. You don't have to drop bombs when you can drop a virus into its networks, a whisper into its headlines, a lie into its consciousness. The battlefield has evolved, and now it wears a suit, carries a briefcase, types quietly in air-conditioned rooms, and signs off with encryption keys instead of trigger fingers. This is the era of cyber warfare and espionage, the new front line where wars are fought with silence, screens, and secrets. And yet the danger is louder than ever. Nations rise and fall today not because of how many tanks they own, but how much data they control. If you can infiltrate a power grid, hijack a defense system, leak classified blueprints, or sabotage communication between allies, you wield more destructive force than any missile ever could. And the terrifying part, most people have no idea it's happening until it's far too late. Ephesians 6:12 tells us, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness." That verse doesn't just apply to spiritual warfare. It applies to the war for information, for influence, for perception. You see, cyber warfare isn't just about stealing secrets. It's about sowing confusion. It's about disrupting systems of trust. It's about creating enough doubt, enough noise that truth becomes irrelevant and chaos becomes normal. And espionage? That's the ancient serpent dressed in a modern suit. It's about new. While the public argues over headlines, the real game is being played in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, between operatives whose names we'll never know. They trade influence like currency. They manipulate markets, broker shadow deals, and pull strings in places we assumed were democratic. You think your vote shapes policy? Sometimes it's the whisper of an unseen agent that sets the agenda before your ballot is even printed. Israel understands this reality better than most. It's not a large nation by land, but by intelligence. It stands as a towering force. Its surveillance systems, its cyber divisions, its Mossad operations. They aren't accessories, they are survival. When surrounded by enemies, you don't wait for the sword. You learn to hear the footsteps before they arrive. And in a digital world, those footsteps come in the form of metadata, intercepted calls, and lines of malicious code hidden in an email. Pakistan, too, is no stranger to this realm. With an intelligence agency as notorious as it is effective, it plays the game on a global scale. Alliances, threats, and backdoor channels flow like currents beneath the public waters of diplomacy. And when two nations with such sophisticated espionage capabilities turn their eyes toward each other, the threat isn't just military. It becomes existential. One miscalculation, one false flag, one leaked document. That's all it takes to unravel years of diplomacy and send nations spiraling into conflict. This is why we must not be lulled into a false sense of security by silence. Just because we don't hear sirens doesn't mean war isn't happening. The real war is already here. It's digital, it's psychological, and it's spiritual. And if we don't learn to discern it, If we don't start asking who is truly writing the narratives we believe, we risk becoming pawns in a game we never even knew we were part of. Tremors in one corner of the desert can trigger avalanches 1,000 miles away. When rockets arc over Gaza or militias clash in Syria, the shock waves do not politely stop at the border. They ricochet through Tehran's corridors, surge across the Strait of Hormuz, and rumble straight into the mountains of Afghanistan and the streets of Islamabad. This is geopolitical physics. Every explosion in the Middle East reverberates through South Asia, altering alliances, inflaming sectarian divides, and yanking economies off balance faster than pundits can spin a headline. Look at oil prices. One drone strike on a Saudi facility sends Brent crude soaring, and suddenly the rupee loses breath, inflation spikes, and millions of Pakistani families wonder how they will cook dinner. Look at refugee flows. Each Syrian exodus strains Turkish resolve, which tilts NATO discussions, which shapes American policy, which then pressures Islamabad to pick a side in a conflict it never asked for. Ripples become tsunamis, because in our interconnected world, distance no longer grants immunity. 1 Kings 19 tells of Elijah fleeing to Horeb, where a great wind shattered rocks, an earthquake shook the ground, and a fire blazed. Yet God was not in the chaos, but in the still small voice that followed. Nations today focus on the fireballs on their screens while missing the subtle policies drafted in quiet rooms, the sanctions, the arms deals, the covert training missions that ultimately steer the region's destiny. When Israel reacts to Iranian proxies, Gulf monarchies recalibrate. India recalculates energy routes. Beijing eyes new ports, and suddenly South Asia's stability ledger is rewritten overnight. Consider sectarian contagion. A hardline sermon in an Iraqi shrine finds its way onto smartphones in Lahore by sunset, inflaming Shia-Sunni tensions faster than any border patrol can intercept. Mosques echo with outrage, processions grow volatile, and governments scramble to pacify streets before Friday prayers ignite something irretrievable. That is the domino effect in living color, faith twisted into fuel by distant conflicts. Arms markets feel the tremor too. When Riyadh orders Patriot batteries or Tehran unveils a new missile, defense contractors salivate, regional rivals panic buy, and budgets intended for hospitals morph into fighter jets. Pakistan eyes India, Bourdieu watches China, China funds ports in Gwadar, and Washington drafts another strategic partnership proposal. Isaiah 2:4 dreams of beating swords into plowshares, yet our era seems obsessed with turning stimulus checks into warheads. Even pop culture cannot outrun the ripple. A controversial Netflix drama about Mossad operations trends in Karachi, sparking social media storms that shape dinner table opinions more potently than parliamentary debates. Minds are molded, votes are cast, and foreign policy is nudged by binge-watching habits. That is how deep the dominoes fall. So when analysts shrug off skirmishes in Gaza as localized, they ignore the freight train of consequences barreling toward Kabul and Karachi. Every ceasefire delayed feeds extremist recruiters who promise vengeance. Every collapsed peace talk emboldens smugglers who thrive in chaos. Every cancelled pilgrimage dents airline revenues, bleeding cash from economies already on crutches. The Book of Romans warns, whether we live unto the Lord, and whether we die unto the Lord. In global politics, whether one nation reels or another rises, each life caught in the domino chain testifies to our collective accountability. And if we fail to grasp that sacred interdependence, the next stone to topple may be the very foundation we assumed was unshakable. Destruction is quick. Press a button, turn a key, and in the span of a heartbeat, whole cities vanish beneath mushroom clouds. Diplomacy, by contrast, is slow, frustrating, even maddening. It requires patience, empathy, and the courage to sit across from someone who might loathe your very existence and still say, let's talk. Yet history screams an irrefutable lesson. Annihilation delivers nothing but ashes, while dialogue, even imperfect dialogue, has the power to rewrite destinies. Think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 nerve-shredding days when the world balanced on the edge of nuclear oblivion. It was not bravado that pulled us back from the brink. It was a private back-channel deal, scribbled on scraps of paper, proof that words can diffuse warheads. Or recall the handshake on the White House lawn between Rabin and Arafat. Imperfect, yes, Fragile, absolutely, but for a fleeting moment it showed how mortal enemies could envision coexistence. Proverbs 15:1 reminds us, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Harsh words today travel at the speed of a tweet. Gentle answers must move faster if they hope to outpace the algorithms of outrage. Consider what is at stake. Israel's Dimona reactors and Pakistan's Kushab complex are not mere facilities. They are arsenals of final judgment. The book of Revelation speaks of fire raining from the heavens, yet modern Ezekiels have replaced flaming chariots with MIRV and hypersonic glide vehicles, capable of erasing entire generations before the first siren finishes wailing. In such a landscape, the true superpower is not the nation with the largest stockpile, but the leader with the largest capacity for restraint. Diplomacy is not weakness, it is strategic courage. It is Gideon trimming his army to 300, proving that wisdom, not numbers, carries the day. It is Moses pleading with Pharaoh again and again, turning stubbornness into eventual release. In our era, it means phone calls at 3 a.m. between generals who despise each other yet respect the apocalyptic cost of miscalculation. It means red line hotlines blinking in subterranean bunkers, ready to translate panic into clarity before satellites misinterpret fireworks as a first strike. Real life offers painfully current illustrations. When Tehran and Washington exchanged prisoners instead of missiles, thousands of families were restored. When Pyongyang paused testing long enough to speak with Seoul, border loudspeakers fell silent. Each diplomatic victory may seem minor compared to the spectacle of warfare, but Matthew 13 tells us the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Tiny at first, then towering. The same principle guides statecraft. Small breakthroughs grow into sturdy treaties that shelter future generations. We must therefore champion negotiators with the same fervor we reserve for soldiers. Teach children about the Oslo Accords and the Camp David summit alongside tales of Normandy. Let them know valor can be shown with a pen as surely as with a rifle. Hold media accountable for elevating calm analysis over incendiary sound bites. Demand that parliaments fund cultural exchanges and scientific collaboration with the same urgency they fund fighter squadrons. Blessed, Jesus said, are the peacemakers, not because they avoid conflict, but because they confront it with wisdom fierce enough to eclipse fear. Let us stop pretending that ignorance is innocence. The world is not a playground. It is a chessboard, and the pieces are moving faster than most care to notice. We've peeled back layers tonight. Not to provoke fear, but to awaken clarity. Behind every headline is a hidden motive, behind every missile a message, and behind every silence a calculation. Israel isn't merely reacting, it's preparing. Pakistan isn't just a distant player. It's a pivotal force in a game that may soon redefine borders, alliances, and destinies. But here's the truth we can't afford to ignore. When we allow division, propaganda, and pride to poison the space between nations, we move closer to a fire no one can put out. And when faith is twisted into fuel for vengeance, instead of light for reconciliation, we become agents of destruction rather than stewards of peace. This is not a time for passivity. This is not a season to scroll. This is a time to question louder, to discern deeper, to speak truth even when it's inconvenient, and to demand leadership that understands war may roar but wisdom whispers longer. Isaiah 1:17 calls us to seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause. That's not a suggestion. That's a command. It is not enough to be informed. We must be transformed. It is not enough to be outraged. We must be engaged. Let this be the moment we stop being spectators of global tension and start becoming messengers of uncomfortable truth. Let this be the night the curtain was pulled back, and we no longer watched in blindness. Let us pray, let us speak, and let us act, because if we don't, the question will not be why Israel might target Pakistan next. It will be why we, the people, saw it coming and did nothing.